Okay. All right. So hello, welcome. We're going to start talking today about Chapter 7. So today we have Dr. Stephen Sireci. He's a distinguished university professor and director of the Center for Educational Assessment in the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His PhD is in psychometrics from Fordham University. His master's and bachelor's degrees are in psychology from Loyola College of Maryland. Previously, he was senior psychometrician at the GED testing service, psychometrician at the Uniform CPA exam, and research supervisor of testing at the Newark Board of Education. His research is primarily in educational test development and evaluation, particularly issues of validity, cross-lingual assessment, standard setting, and computer-based testing. He has authored or co-authored over 160 publications and is the co-architect of the multi-stage adaptive Massachusetts adult proficiency tests. He is on several advisory committees, including committees for Texas, Puerto Rico, and Chile, is a fellow of AERA, a fellow of Division 5 of APA, and past co-editor of the International Journal of Testing and the Journal of Applied Testing Technology. He was president of NERA, president of NCME during the period 2019 through 2020, and currently the president-elect of the International Test Commission. His awards include the School of Education's Outstanding Teacher Award, Chancellor's Medal, Award for Outstanding Accomplishments in Research and Creative Activity, and Conti Faculty Fellowship from University of Massachusetts, the Award for Distinguished Mentoring from NERA, and the Unsung Hero Award from Loyola College Rugby. Dr. Sireci served in the public reviews of the 2014 standards done by the Center for Educational Assessment at UMass Amherst. And most recently, he has been on the lead of the International Test Commission, Association of Test Publishers Guidelines for Technology-Based Assessments.
Thanks, Maggie, for that extensive introduction. I appreciate that. And I thank Sergio for squeezing in the Loyola College Rugby Unsung Hero Award. It doesn't seem that long ago when I was in college, and I remember someone telling me, you might win lots of awards, but this one is going to be the most important. And he was right. But I also remember serving on the NCME Graduate Student Issues Committee and how much fun that was. In fact, it was started, I think I was on the second committee ever back in 1990. So it's important work you guys are doing, and before you know it, you'll have earned your gray hairs and you'll be 20, 30 years into your career too. So thanks for having me here today.
Can I do a comment, Maggie? Yeah, thank you, Professor Sireci, for accepting to participate today. I wanted to mention that, well, I mean, definitely we are super happy to have you today and that you accepted to be the expert for this chapter. And actually, at some point, I feel that you're kind of overqualified, maybe. If you see like the size of the chapter and your trajectory, I don't know, I think they're very important. And I really appreciate that you accepted to be the expert on this chapter in particular, because it's very important, but maybe in the standards it doesn't have enough, I don't know, room or relevance. So yeah, thank you very much. And well, I mean, full disclosure, Professor Sireci is my advisor. And because of that, I know also that first, the technical documentation on the test that we do at UMass is very, very good. Actually, before entering into the program, the technical documentation for the MAP test for me, it was like a very great example on how can you write documentation. And also my understanding is that you, Steve, also tried at some point to kind of push for making awards and kind of recognizing the work of people that have built technical documentation. So also I think you are like the right person, the best person actually for this chapter, because you have shown like very authentic interest into this topic. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sergio. Those are kind words. Yeah, my second job in psychometrics, I was working for the GED testing service. I was 29 years old. I was the senior psychometrician there, and there was no other psychometrician. So it was like senior psychometrician, no junior psychometrician. And one of my tasks was to put out the next version of the technical manual for the GED testing service. And they were celebrating their 50th anniversary, I think. So there was some history in there. So it was a pretty intense project, and it gave me a lot of ideas and training and how to kind of think about that task, approach that task. And the standards for educational and psychological testing have helped a lot at that time, and I think still do. So the technical manual you're mentioning for the MAP, the Massachusetts Adult Proficiency Test, really kind of follows this framework we've been thinking about for how to really structure a validity argument, and how to structure the technical documentation. I can ramble and ramble. I don't know if you guys want to ask specific questions or.
Yeah, so I thought we'd kind of start with the questions that came up from our original discussion session. I'll just kind of post those,
Sure.
project those, and then if other questions come up or we kind of go on sort of a different discussion, I think that's totally fine too, since we're such a small group today. So we can go ahead.
Sounds good.
And let's start with the first one. Okay. So this again came up, and it was just, if we were to create an outline for documentation, what would be the most important headings that are applicable to any test?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So when I saw the question, off the top of my head, I came up with what I think would be the major topics, and then after that, I checked with the MAP technical manual, and it was almost the same thing. But one heading should be the purpose of the document, right? So what's the purpose of whatever? Is it a technical manual or whatever documentation you have? But then the next thing is the purpose of the test, right? So I think that's important because validity starts with and ends with the purpose of the test, right? So we're trying to, validity is the degree to which evidence and theory support the use of a test for a particular purpose. So if we're not clear about that, then I think, things can really fall apart from that point. And here's where, Sergio and I have had several discussions, and we've had discussions with other students and faculty at UMass. There is kind of this tension between saying what the purpose of the test is and not saying what it is, particularly in the for-profit testing sector. Because if you don't specify exactly what the test is, and people might use it for lots and lots of purposes, you can sell more tests there that way, right? But academically, we think of, tests are developed with specific purposes in mind, and those purposes need to be articulated. So typically, I think there's a whole chapter on the purpose of the test. Next would be, I don't know if I would use these terms, but next would be a chapter on the constructs that are measured. I might say knowledge, skills, and abilities, or assessment framework, or something like that. But you really want to, in psychometric language, you want to talk about what are the constructs measured and how do we operationally define them. So here we talk about the test specifications, for example, and the process we used to pull them together, who was involved, and so forth. And then a chapter basically lays out the whole test development process from the test specifications forward. So how items were written, how items were reviewed, item analysis, sensitivity review, item calibration, pilot samples, pilot testing, those sorts of things. And then a chapter on development of the score scale, how the score scale is developed, followed by standard setting, if that's relevant. So not all tests have standards on them, but certainly how the standards were set for most of the achievement tests. Then a chapter on reliability, measurement, precision, one on validity, of course, one on score interpretation, and then one on supporting documentation. So it might be helpful. I can share my screen to just show the table of contents for the map to see if that's helpful. I think it might be helpful. Let me see. But I think you're going to have to either let me be a yeah, there we go. Let's see if that works.
Just made you co-host.
Thanks. All right. Yeah. So I'm going to share. This is online. So it might be hard to Google. I'll post the URL in the chat, but I've gone, past the title page and the front material to just the table of contents. So we see chapter 1 is introduction and purpose of the manual. Now, this particular manual was for a new version of the MAP. So we wanted to give the history of what we call like the 4 generations of the MAP. And then the new MAP, so MAP is Massachusetts Adult Proficiency Test. You see that here. College and career readiness. That was the new variation of it. And the date on this technical manual is 2018, so not super old. And then it's a description of it. So the purpose and what it is we're measuring. You've got overall description, the process for developing the test specifications. So the committees we pulled in, who they were. and then the specifications for math, specifications for reading. Because it's a multi-stage adaptive test, we thought this was a good place to describe that here. And how it basically works, how is it used in practice? And because it's multi-stage, how do you start people? So some of that, you'll see some graphs on, the design behind the test. One thing we don't have here, because it's happened in the past 4 years, is there's a lot more emphasis on culturally sustaining anti-racist practices in testing. So we haven't, like we did sensitivity review, that would be in one of these subsections here. But I think in test development moving forward, we want to center that. So we probably have an additional section on that. Then we have, test construction procedures, item development, review, revision, supporting material, pilot testing. Here's the sensitivity review part. How we pull together the modules and the panels. So really trying to explain a lot. And then the score scale. How do we scale the tests? There are standards set on this test. The NRS is a U.S. Department of Education kind of required achievement levels. They're called educational functioning levels. So we talk about how the scores map onto these achievement levels. Chapter on validity. And here's basically our framework. We use the purposes of the test and then the 5 sources of validity evidence. And that's kind of how we structure it. And then, we summarize that evidence into a validity argument. Test administration procedures. This is the one I forgot when I just off the top of my head, but how do you administer the test? People have to be certified to administer it. Test accommodations, security, and then a chapter on score interpretation. Something about looking forward, but also appendices like research reports, links to additional resources, lists of committee members, and test administration manual, and so forth. So let me stop there. Maybe you have some questions, but that's kind of like a really comprehensive answer. It's like, how do I go about, thinking about what should be documented? Definitely the purpose of the test, how you just defined what it is you're measuring, how scores should be interpreted, what the scale means, validity argument, those sorts of things.
Do you think there are any parts that would be either included or removed depending on the kind of test that it was? Are there any sort of things that aren't necessary for certain kinds of tests?
It's a really good question. And the answer is yes. So some tests, for example, some college admissions tests don't really have standards set on them. Like more recently, they've had college readiness benchmarks, and there should be some information on that. But if it's a test that doesn't have, like a norm reference test that doesn't have standards on it, you wouldn't have that chapter. However, in that context, you'd have to have a chapter on the norms, right? Who are the norm groups? What was the representativeness of the norms? The demographic characteristics, all those. So a separate chapter on norming would be required. So it really depends on the purpose of the test, like what other things might go into it.
Does anyone else have any other questions about sort of it more broadly or about the test booklet we just saw? And I guess we'll go to the next one.
Maggie, one other thing before you go to the next one. One other answer to your question is scoring. Like if there's any scoring of constructor responses, the map is all objectively scored. So we didn't have that. But if you have human scoring or computer-based scoring, there should be some information, not only on the process, but the inter-rater reliability and those sorts of things too.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. All right. Okay. So our next question was, and I also put the standard below in case, we don't have them all memorized. For standard 7.1, there are many known misuses of state accountability tests, but these typically aren't listed in the test manuals. How do we better explain what the test can and cannot do to all stakeholders?
This is a really important question, right? So first of all, it requires us to have somewhat of a crystal ball. Like what are the potential ways people could really, screw up the use of test scores? But on the other hand, it's not that hard to think of them because there's so many criticisms of tests. And those criticisms actually are, if you think about it, misuses, like teaching to the test might be a misuse, or taking too much testing time, right? You don't want to give students a week to take it if they only need a day, those sorts of things. But it's funny, just yesterday I was given testimony to the Colorado State Department of Education because they're using measures of student growth in their teacher evaluation systems. And it's pretty interesting to listen to the pros and cons for that. So there's a bill on the floor of the state Congress in Colorado to take out measures of student growth, or at least not require a percentage of student growth that goes into the evaluation of a teacher. So right now in Colorado, teachers are evaluated 50% based on the students, their average student growth percentiles. Now, I don't know if you know, student growth percentiles are incredibly unreliable, and in my opinion, shouldn't be used for anything. I mean, there's just so much error inherent in them. So that's kind of what I was saying. But we had people standing up saying, we need to, hold teachers accountable. We need to make sure our students are, being taught by quality teachers and teachers are effective. And then the people who were in favor of the legislation, which was to take away that 50% percentage. They said, leave it up to the schools if they want to use any percentage of SGP at all. But the point is the use of SGPs for teacher evaluation is an example of misuse, right? It's not validated. No one has really done research. There's been one study in the past 12 years that showed a very small correlation between another measure of teacher effectiveness and SGPs. I think the correlation was like 0.25. So, I think that's an example of misuse. And in accountability, I think policymakers and others really trust the results of tests and use them for purposes beyond which they were designed, and don't really listen to the cautions. So it's not that test developers and people doing research on testing aren't saying, use multiple measures, be more cautious. They're just used, and it's really, really frustrating. So I don't know how to better explain what tests can and cannot do because, just yesterday I prepared a 3-minute testimony, put a lot of thought into it. I thought it was really clear. And the question I got was, what do you mean by SGPs? And I'm like, SGPs are what you're using for all the teachers in your state. How can you not realize that's what I mean? So I think this is important. And when I see the first thing you have here, there are many no misuses of state accountability tests. There are and there aren't. I think there are many criticisms of that. So I think as responsible test developers and as responsible people developing documentation for tests, we have to embrace the criticisms. We have to look for criticisms and then think about them when we're describing appropriate and inappropriate uses of the tests in our documentation.
And then in terms of making the information more accessible to different kinds of stakeholders, even people who, should be informed about the basics but aren't, how can we make this easier for them to understand?
Yeah, it's another good question. And it's similar to a question that might be coming up. When I looked at Chapter 7 again to prepare for this call, it is short, as Sergio pointed out. And that says something right there. I think it would be helpful to include a table in that chapter that's here's the different types of let me start again. Here are the different types of documentation you should have for different audiences. So the technical manual that I put on the screen before, that's great for us, right? Everyone on this call, you'd be interested in just about every chapter there. Oh, look at multi-stage design and hey, test information functions, stuff that we really geek out on. But most people who are using the map, they don't care about that stuff. They want to know more basic, what can I do with the scores? What does it tell me? How long is the test going to take? So I think test developers do have to put out different types of documents. The technical manual is I like having one technical manual that has all of the information that the psychometric community can go to for evaluating the technical quality of the assessment. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have either excerpts from it or totally independent documents for different stakeholder audiences. So typically we have a document for test administrators. How do you administer it? It's really helpful to have a document on score interpretation, and then that's for the teacher or the student, for example. a lot of the technical documentation associated with the statewide achievement tests is geared towards what the federal peer reviewers want. So the peer review guidance has determined a lot of that. There should be a document on test accommodations. So I think knowing and anticipating the stakeholders, the people who are going to be involved in the testing process, and thinking about how do we best communicate information for each of them. And I think it's okay if you might not have documents, but if you have websites where people can go to get the information, I think that's good too. But as the standards point out, documentation on tests need to be available for people who are interested in using the test, or for people who are being forced to take the tests, for lack of a better description. A lot of people find themselves having to take these tests and they want to find out more information about them.
Well, thank you for that one. Are there any other follow-up questions or comments about this topic? Okay.
Maggie, I'm looking at my notes, and I will say one other thing about that one. As I mentioned before, the new awareness, new for people like me, the new awareness on anti-racism and testing and culturally sustaining assessment, I think that's part of what we have to warn people about in test interpretations too, right? We think of tests as being objectives and that they're the same for everybody, but now we know they're really not, or at least our field has acknowledged they're really not. So I think part of this is explaining, how scores might need to be interpreted differently for people from different backgrounds and cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can definitely dig into that towards the end because I have some more questions about that, but that's definitely something to think about that we haven't considered. So the next question from the board was, how often documentation about a test should be updated, and should it be part of the standards?
Yeah, I almost want to do a poll on that. Like, what do people think? I mean, 5 years pops into my head, right? And a lot of testing contracts are like 5 years or 3 years or something like that. But in general, I think anytime anything changes that would impact score interpretation. So if there's a content change, right? So every time like a state updates its curriculum frameworks, like we did for the MAPT, if it's been a long time since a test has been renormed and norms are relevant, I think 10 years has been a rough guideline for that. If there's any new breakthroughs in the construct definition or in teaching practices that necessitates a change in the test, then the documentation should follow that. So it's hard to say. So one of your questions, should that be part of the standards? I think so. And I think the standards do say in different chapters, like, norms should be updated periodically or something like that. And periodically is a vague word. So should we put a bit more teeth behind that by saying 5 years or 10 years or whatever? I think that's worth talking about.
Yeah, I think definitely. Does anyone have any kind of follow-ups or questions or comments about that? So we already kind of started this conversation a little bit, but there are many audiences related to a test: the public, the community of experts, institutional users, examining users, but not documents for each. Implicitly, the standards suggest that there should be documents explaining well for each, but it is not clear that maybe and not done that too often. So should the standards be more acknowledge this and be more explicit about this?
I think they should. So again, that the standard on documentation is a little bit short, and I think it would be good because it talks very generally about documentation. Well, what do we mean? What types of documentation? When you're pulling out another statement that's somewhat fake, like what types of audiences? Why not give some examples, right? So I gave some examples before. You want test administrator's manual, accommodations manual, technical manual, and I'm picturing like a table with the rows are different types of documentation, and the columns are the next one, different stakeholders. Like, what stakeholders are these targeted towards? So score report interpretation guides, parents and teachers, test accommodation guides, test administrator, students, teachers, and so forth. So I think the standards, the next version, should spell that out a bit better. I want to say one other thing. It's not so much on this question, but when I was a student in graduate school, I started graduate school in 1987. And so I was dealing with the 1985 standards at first. And then came the 1999 standards. So this is my third version in my professional career. I'm pretty sure, and I wanted to research this before the call, but I really thought that the standards in this chapter used to say that technical documentation for a test had to be available at the time the test was being used. This version in 2014 says, well, the technical manual could come out afterwards. And that's something that bothers me a little bit. And as I hear myself say that, I know how hard it is to get the technical documentation out, because you're putting together you're doing the standard setting, you're doing the scaling, you're calibrating your items, and you're doing all your validity checks and your simulation studies. So there's a lot going on. But I really think that the technical documentation to support the use of a test should come out at the same time or before the test is used operationally. So if I'm involved with the next version of the standards, I would try and put that in there. One of the issues with the standards, I think, is there was a lot of compromise going back and forth with what was written and then what people could live with. And if you say, oh, the technical documentation should come out in a timely manner, yeah, everyone can agree with that. What's a timely manner, though, right? That's your next question. But to say the technical documentation should come out at the same time or before tests are used operationally, that's concrete, right? I think that's a good goal, but I think not everybody thinks they can do that. But I think we should be able to at least have preliminary versions of technical documentation so that the information that's given meets the standards, and the standards say stakeholders should be informed on whether they want to use this test.
Can I just say that that makes a ton of sense? And I think another example is the phrase "where feasible." The phrase "where feasible" turns up quite a bit, and like you're saying, if it's just given a little bit of definition, I think that's helpful. But it can be hard. Like if I'm in a testing company and I'm responsible to make returns for shareholders because it's a for-profit company, what is feasible and what is not kind of changes in that context.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brendan. I mean, so the where feasible gives you some wiggle room, and a lot of it is not just profit and we don't want to spend the money on it, but it is hard sometimes. So one example is, let's say diff studies should be done on all relevant identifiable subgroups, right? And then you say, well, we should not just do students with disabilities, but students with different types of disabilities. And all of a sudden now you're in sample sizes that are really too small for diff. So kind of the where feasible, there's a lot of practical factors that I think we do need to give room for the where feasible. But I think the other thing you're saying is that where feasible could be used as an excuse. And we don't want people to take advantage of that and not do the research that we think they can do, or we think they should do, and they just say it's not feasible. So that is a tricky one, and I think some of the reviewers of the standards have been involved in court cases and so forth, and want to have that wiggle room, and I think some wiggle room probably is needed. It's just a question of how much. So I don't like the use of where feasible throughout, but it probably doesn't need to exist in some places.
So I'm thinking more about student examinees, especially in a K-12 setting, but I know from experience being a teacher that students often internalize their score as like a sort of identity marker about their level of ability in that skill. Like, I'm a 2, so I'm not good at math, and so on. So how could we try to make some of this documentation more student-friendly, where it's not does not have bearing on their like deep, emotional and mathematical self-efficacy and things like that?
Maggie, that bothers me so much, the issue you're bringing up. So I don't think it's so much a technical documentation issue, but more of a score reporting one. So one of my former students, Francis, who's now at the National Board of Medical Examiners, just finished, Francis O'Donnell, did a dissertation looking at all the different labels that students are given across the United States. And she just focused on the 2 lowest achievement levels. And Florida might still be using the label of inadequate, right? So students would bring their, here, mom, I'm inadequate, right? And when I was giving my NCME presidential address, I started off with a story about when I was really young, like second grade or something, my mom explaining my test score report to me. She was explaining what a percentile rank was and what a look. So I kind of had this nice, picture in my head of parents, sitting down with their students to talk about school, to talk about their test performance. And, I really worry about self-fulfilling prophecies and demoralizing students or reducing their academic self-concept. So, I've been thinking more positive assessment. How can we phrase things positively? So Francis's dissertation actually is interesting because she shows the variety of achievement levels that are used, and talks about the difference in perceptions across teachers and parents with respect to how encouraging they are. It was just published in a journal called Educational Assessment. If you are interested in that, I can send it to you. Super interestingly, the state of Maryland has just started a statewide study where they're putting in front of students and teachers different versions of score reports where what the achievement level says differs. So they're taking a proactive stance, saying, how can we come up with achievement labels on our score reports when we finalize them that are more encouraging? So it's always bothered me that there's been really no research in how these labels come about. I don't know if it's just boards of education saying basic, proficient, advanced, failing, whatever. But there really should be some researchers by developmental psychologists and others. What are the best ways to describe performance in a way that's not just like categorizing students, but that will help them develop academically? The best score scale I liked that has achievement levels is the College Board's AP scale. So 5 is extreme. It's a 5-point scale. 5 is extremely well qualified. I might not have this perfectly right. 4 is like well qualified. 3 is qualified. 2 is possibly qualified, and 1 is no recommendation. None of those are negative, right? So I think there's probably some research that went into that. And I think we need to do more of that because the problem you're bringing up goes beyond documentation, but really impacts students, their academic self-concept, I think, teachers, the way they think about students. This student's inadequate. Why should I waste my time on them? And score report interpretation, how people feel about tests in general.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely something to dig into and to start working on maybe for the next iteration of a lot of the work that we're all doing. So moving to the next question, Standard 7.11 speaks about case studies. What is that exactly and what might that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't really know. I'll tell you what I think. So the standards, remember, they're the standards for educational and psychological testing. So I think the case studies might be more on the psychological testing side where, if you have a psychological test that involves one-on-one and then they write up a report and they're categorizing the person in this way, they might have a case study that exemplifies that report. So I think that's probably what they're referring to, but I'm not 100% sure. What this reminds me of that's particularly relevant to educational testing is with respect to scoring rubrics for like writing assessments, right? So you might have exemplars of this is a 6, this is a 4, this is a 2, and that sort of thing. And in such cases, I think we'd want to have many exemplars that would reflect kind of the different ways students from different cultures might meet that standard of a 4 or a 6 or a 2 or whatever.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other follow-up questions or comments about that one? I know just scoring the math open-ended responses, they do give like student work examples from, I think it's scored on like a 4 to a 1 scale, and they give you like student work samples, or maybe I don't know if it's actually real student work or if they just sort of find somebody and make fake student work, but they give examples that could look like. So maybe that's another example. So moving on to the next question, what is the best way to document a validity argument? Should it go in the technical documentation or as a separate document or just a series of studies?
Well, that's a good question. So I don't think, so a series of studies doesn't sound like a validity argument to me, right? So the validity argument would be kind of like the synthesis of those studies. Should it go in technical documentation? I think so. Or as a separate document, that's not a bad idea. Why not break, so you've got it in your technical manual. Now break it out as a separate document for particular audiences. Like here's the validity argument for test X or test Y. So I like that idea. So I've been involved with a few states in looking at how they're, they'll send like a draft of their technical manual, and some states will just have very short, something very short, or maybe the 5 sources of validity evidence, or maybe just a couple of sources of validity evidence, and not kind of tie it together. So you saw what we did for the maps, where we have a validity chapter, and we basically, the way I think about the process of validation is you cross the purposes of the tests. You think about the purposes of the test, the explicit purposes, the potential misuses of the test, and you cross that with the 5 sources of validity evidence. And so I've written about this a little bit, and I could post a couple of documents in the chat. So that allows us to say, here's why we're doing these different validity studies. Because if the purpose of the test is to describe, how well students have mastered content at a particular grade level, we know that's going to require validity evidence based on test content. So now the studies that we're doing, the alignment studies or any content validation study, they fit in that cell of the validity kind of table. So in thinking about structuring in that way, that's kind of like an outline of the validity argument. So your validity argument talk about, here's the purpose of the test, right? Because again, validity refers to the degree to which the evidence in theory we have is going to be supportive of that purpose and use. So we start with the purpose and use, and given the purposes and also our considerations, our anticipations of potential misuses, here are the studies we've done. Here are the people we've involved. You just read, our definition of the construct, how we got people to help us with test specifications, the item analysis we do. So that's kind of how I structure the whole technical manual. So it builds up to that validity chapter. Some people might put score interpretation before that chapter, because a lot of people think, well, score interpretation is really where the validity resides. Because if people aren't interpreting the scores right, then they're not going to be used appropriately and so forth. And I'm sympathetic to that. But basically, if you're describing the studies you've done, the validity argument kind of pulls it all together. So it's the synthesis. There's I'm going to share my screen one more time. There's one paragraph. It's 2 sentences. It's the end of the validity chapter before the standards start that kind of answer a couple of questions you've asked me today. Like what do you want to put in a technical manual? What do you want to document? So let me share my screen and show you. I use this quote a lot. I'm going to cancel your screen sharing, sorry. And here it is. I'm just going to pull up the standards for a second. And I know it's page 22. Let me see if I can move. There we go. Where is it? Oh, sorry, I'm a couple of pages. Okay. Now I have to hide you guys. So if we look at this right here, different components of validity evidence are described in subsequent chapters of the standards and include evidence of careful test construction, adequate score reliability, appropriate test administration and scoring, accurate score scaling, equating, and standard setting, and careful attention to fairness for all test takers as appropriate to the test interpretation in question. So that the last sentence of there is almost like the table of contents that we want, right? And I skipped the first sentence, which is also important here. Ultimately, the validity of an interpretation of test scores relies on all the available evidence relevant to the technical quality of the testing system. So all the evidence is relevant. And now what you're asking me about is how do you synthesize that? And I think you first lay it out, and then it's just kind of like summarizing a study or a dissertation that you've done. And I think it's appropriate and important to also just lay out what we don't know. So in talking about the validity work we've done on the maps, I typically show people, I'll say, here are the purposes of the test and the misuse, and here are the 5 sources of validity evidence, and here's what we've done. And you see some holes there. And I'm like, we haven't done everything. And part of it, this goes back to your comment on where feasible, Brendan. Part of it is time, part of it is resources. And what we're absolutely going to do is what we have to do, right? So the federal government has certain criteria we have to meet to get the test approved. So that's, first and foremost, we have to do that. That doesn't mean we're not going to talk about the other things we need to do and we're still working on. And there are things that we're still working on for 10 years that we haven't crossed off the list yet. And part of it has to do with our resources. And, there's only so much Sergio and Brendan can do for us. But we keep it on the list because we know that there's still more work to be done.
Absolutely. Does anyone have some kind of follow-up questions or comments related to that one? So I'll move on to, these are sort of more food for thought things that came up. I went to, there's a series on assessment and DEI considerations that's been going on, I think this whole month. And yesterday's session was more about K-12 assessment. And so this kind of came up a little bit yesterday, and I think it's a work in progress, and I think it's probably something that we'll all be working on for many years to come. But more about how do we address DEI considerations within the technical documentation? How do they, what are the requirements? What should be the layout for that? And this is kind of more of an open discussion as opposed to anything else, but just kind of what should be documented and what parts of both cultural and linguistically responsive content should be discussed, and how much, is there a certain minimum threshold, or what should be the initial start of this work in general, but also just what do we document in the technical manual?
Maggie, these are great questions. So I did mention before, I think this is new. So I think in the test development chapter, we'd have probably a new section on anti-racist test development, culturally sustaining assessment, making sure that's part of the process. And with the new test that we're starting at UMass, the Adult Skills Assessment Program, we're starting from that perspective. I used to think I was one of the experts in sensitivity review, and I was really proud of my work. And I would give workshops. Here's how you do sensitivity review. And my colleague Jennifer Randall has just turned everything on its head. And it's actually, the way we do sensitivity review is promoting this, systemic system of whiteness, this white worldview, that this is the way we should do things, and anything that might be too culturally specific gets chopped out. So we're trying to gear the test towards this culture that's appropriate for everybody. It's almost like, I hate to use the term culture free, but we're anything that might be advantageous to whites, we're taking out. Everything that might be advantageous to blacks, we're taking out. And what really happens is what's you're left with is most culturally familiar to whites. Why? Because it's all the whites who are in charge of test development. So it seems appropriate to us. So so sensitivity review has been about chopping stuff out, and anti-racist assessment is about putting stuff in to acknowledge that racism is present, and by doing that, present in society and in assessment, and by doing that, you're acknowledging the worth and the value of the cultures that have been historically oppressed. So I'm excited about this, but I haven't done it yet, right? So I think trying to orient your test development processes from an anti-racist perspective is the first step. And that's where we are. Related to it, it's kind of what I was talking about a couple of years ago, and about understandardization, where you understand, you do actual research to understand the heterogeneity within your population of people tested. So I think that's going to help too in just understanding who it is we're testing, what their different needs are, and that's kind of typical. But the newer thing is what their particular strengths are. And if we can allow, this isn't so much test development, but if we can allow students to bring what many people are calling their funds of knowledge to the testing situation. So we set up the test administration conditions in a way where they can access their particular assets that aren't typically assets. So for example, if you're bilingual, why not let you access both languages while you're taking the test, right? If it's not a test of language proficiency, why is that not okay? So we're acknowledging or starting to understand that we really have promoted the idea that students learn in different ways. And students bring a lot of different things to the classroom. So if I were bilingual and I was dealing with bilingual students, I might mix in some Spanish or whatever language in my conversations with them. Now I'm going to give them an assessment. It's like, no, you can't do that. You know you're a very skilled Spanish speaker, but no, you just have to use English on this. So that's just one example of how we can kind of build more diversity, equity, and inclusion into the assessment process.
And finally, more about how do we, for test documentation that's made for students and families and even for teachers, how do we engage those different stakeholders in the test documentation development process?
Yeah, so I think, I'm sure I should be thinking more comprehensively, but what immediately comes to mind is our connection with parents is the score report. And I think state departments of education have done a pretty good job about putting things on the score report, like where to go for more information. But score reports can be difficult to interpret. And one of the things we talked about was, the labels that are on the score report, like is your son or daughter emerging or whatever. So I think we have to do more about that, getting those labels right. But in running focus groups with parents, it's on score reports, like there's two flavors to the focus groups. One is, what do you like? What kind of information are you looking for? And the other is, what do you prefer? Like, do you prefer these types of reports or those types of reports? And people prefer different things. People understand different things. So trying to get one report that fits everybody is really hard. So I like the dynamic reporting where people can go into a website and kind of configure their own reports, but that's not for everybody either, right? You have to be technologically savvy to do that. But my favorite comment from a parent in a focus group, we were talking about, margin of error around the score report and explaining what the margin of error was. And the parent was like, well, why are you giving my daughter a test with error? I want you to give them the test that doesn't have any error. And I was like, oh, that's just beautiful, right? Of course, So the standards are saying we should, report margins of error and that sort of thing. And that makes sense. But a margin of error has been something that really seems to be misinterpreted. People don't like, they don't understand. So one way to maybe thread that needle is to say, here's the person's score. And if you want to know more about the margin of error, you can go here. So maybe I think reports with hyperlinks might be helpful. So a score report is not really documentation, but if a parent's looking at a score report and it says where to go for more information, then there's a parent, what to know about the MAP or what to know about the Colorado state test or whatever state you're in. Click here, and then you've got not a technical manual, but documentation that says, here's the purpose of the test, maybe some frequently answered questions that parents might have. So I think targeting some of that documentation for parents is helpful. And a lot of state departments of education not only do that, but do that in multiple languages, which I think is also helpful.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely a good step. I think in some cases, I think we also need to do a sort of a similar process for schools, like principals and teachers as well, because I think the same sort of misconceptions take place. And so having kind of a dynamic website or, list of, sort of executive summaries or even more like watered down or more, easy to understand, very simple documents might be something that's good for teachers as well.
Yeah, teachers as well. That's a good point. I just did post in the chat my answer to the validity argument question. A couple of sites there.
Awesome, wonderful. Does anyone else have any kind of like follow-up questions? Oh, so please, Sergio has a question.
Yes, I have a question. Two questions actually. So the things that through the sessions of the study group, there has been this conversation about whether the standard, so when it is necessary not to just have a standard, but also have something more prescriptive, like a more specific recommendation on how to do things. And we have been doing this question to different experts on the topic on each chapter, and the idea of having best practices is appearing to be something interesting. However, because we know that the standard can be a bit hard to find a consensus, to create the best practices for everybody can be a challenge too. So I wonder if you feel that if in specific about documentation, how close we are to a consensus about best practices. How diverse is like the opinions? Is it kind of there is a consensus there, or we are too far away from that, particularly on documentation?
It's a good question. We're really good at debating. So I don't know how much consensus we have. I mean, people will argue with me about, whether validity evidence based on testing consequences should be part of validity. And I'm like, well, you know how I feel. Of course, it should be. So if we can't get consensus on some of the bigger theoretical questions, can we get consensus on some of the more practical issues? I don't know. I don't remember if it was 1999 or 1985. I think it was the 1985 version of the standards. For each standard, it was listed as primary, conditional, or secondary. There were 3 levels. And so primary was, yeah, you have to meet this. But then that got dropped out. And if I were involved in the next version of the standards, I think a conversation about whether something like that should be brought back is going to come up. I think some standards are absolutely, you have to meet them. Like having technical documentation available, describing the purpose of the test. One thing I didn't mention that's disappointing about the documentation chapter in this version, it doesn't say you have to document the construct measured. And if you read the chapter on fairness, that chapter talks so much about the construct, because you have to really document the construct to know what's accommodation and what's a modification and what parts can be accommodated and so forth. So I think definition of the construct has to be documented. And so for me, that's a primary, right? So I would be hopeful that we could get consensus around a few things, maybe 1 or 2 standards in each chapter that, but people say their tests meet the standards for educational and psychological testing. What does that mean? It's every test says we meet the standards for educational and psychological testing. And I know for a fact on some court cases I've been involved with, people have said that without even opening up the standards. They just, so there's no seal of approval. There's been a lot of conversation. In fact, I think some of you were at the session at NCME last year that had to do with an enforcement mechanism for the standards. Can we have, can we put some teeth behind the standards and have them be enforceable? They are used in court a lot, but so when the standards are used in court, it's pretty much content validity and standard setting evidence that is brought forward. But I've recently heard that this is going to sound so bizarre to you, but I recently heard the licensure tests for lawyers have said that they don't have to comply with the standards. And it just blew my mind. Like, lawyers of all the professions, right, you would think would want to have some standard. But yeah, so now I'm wondering if the legal certification tests, because there's a national licensing test, and then each state licenses a lawyer. So there's a licensing test in each state, multi-state bar exam, and then state bar exams. Or, if we held those tests up to the standards for validity in the standards for educational and psychological testing, how would they compare to other licensure tests? I'm really curious about that question. And how would we answer it? Documentation. We'd have to look at the documentation. Looks like we have another minute. I'll tell a real quick story, but one of the most interesting consulting jobs I ever had was I was asked to compare, there's 2 ways you can get licensed to be a doctor in the United States. One is there's a licensing exam called the United States Medical Licensing Exam that MDs take. The other is a licensing exam that doctors of osteopathy take. So I was asked to kind of like look at these exams, and when I asked for the documentation, I was basically going to compare the validity arguments. And one testing program sent me their documentation in like a huge box. Can't even show it to you. And the other came in a FedEx envelope. And this was before things were digital, right? This was before 2000. So a lot of it, when we're evaluating tests, evaluating the use of a test for a particular purpose, we're looking at their documentation. So, I appreciate being invited here today to talk about that, because it is really important. Most people, when you think of the standards, you think of the reliability validity chapter, but this is a particularly important one. So thanks for pulling that out for a special discussion.
Absolutely. Are there any other follow-up kind of questions or sort of last minute comments as we're running out of time? Okay. Well, I want to thank you guys all for being here, and also especially Dr. Sireci for being here and sharing all your extreme wealth of knowledge with us about all of different documentation. Thank you so much just for being here and taking all of our questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Maggie, and everybody, and I appreciate being here, and hopefully I'll see you all in San Diego.
Yes.
Bye.
All right, have a good weekend.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so I can stop.